We're going to keep talking about epistemology. Remember last time we talked about rationalism? So that's the theory that the main way that we ascertain what is true is through our reason. That's the main source of knowledge. But then there's empiricism. And we'll talk about some of that today. Empiricism, the epistemological theory that the main source or the primary source of knowledge is experience. And so let's go all the way back to Aristotle, who was an empiricist. His empiricism was like this: forms are in things. This is the basis for his empiricism, that forms are in things. Now remember, Plato considered forms something that was in another world. They were in another world. They represent the things in the world of becoming, but they're in the world of being. Aristotle, on the other hand, even though he believed in the forms, thought that these forms are actually in things, not in a transcendent world. And he believed that general or universal ideas are necessary for knowledge, as Plato did. But these are formed in the mind through our experience of individual things. So it is by induction from repeated experiences of the formal element, the essence of a thing in individuals. For example, the form man, which all of us men are represented in. The form man is the essence of humanity. It's the nature of man. Well, it is by induction, that is through pulling this out of us, that the universal idea takes root in the intellect. So we see the things around us and we see, okay, there's something common there, and we pull that out and it takes root in our intellect. And these universal ideas become building blocks of knowledge and discourse. Now, St. Thomas of Aquinas, he, like Aristotle, believed that universal ideas, necessary for knowledge, so he was a realist, he believed in the forms in some sense, they're derived from experience of particular things. And it is by abstraction that the common or formal element is drawn from particular things, resulting in universal ideas. So this abstraction, this removal, it's a little bit different than induction, I guess, but this is it's a removal from something else. That's what abstraction is. It's drawing it out. So we're abstracting a common nature through our experience, so that we can say, this would be an abstraction, Socrates is a man. So we abstract that conclusion, or we can draw that conclusion, Socrates is a man, by noticing all the men, all the people that from which we understand what the nature of man is, and then we can come to this conclusion. We can point to a particular and say, Socrates is a man. So it's through abstraction. Now let's look at modern empiricism. John Locke. First of all, we want to say that he refuted innate ideas. Remember, Plato had this idea that ideas are innate, they're built into our minds. Well, he said, no, if they were innate, then they would be known by children or the mentally handicapped. Now he actually used the word idiot because that was the term that he was used to talk about the many mental handicapped then, but he refuted these innate ideas through that argument. And he said, as all empiricists would say, that the source of knowledge is experience. But what does he mean by that? What does he mean by experience? He says there are two kinds of experience. There's sensation, which comes from the external world, so it's an external experience by which objects in the world enter our minds. Okay, so this is the kind of experience that maybe we would be most familiar with. And then the other kind of experience is reflection. Now this sounds more like reason, but he's talking about this as experience. There's internal experience. Internal experience of the operations of our mind. So thinking, willing, doubting. Well, that sounds like reason to me, doesn't it to you? But he calls it experience. So you have sensation and you have reflection. He talks about how the mind is passive and active. The passive mind receives simple ideas from sensation and reflection. So simple ideas. And then the active mind compounds simple ideas into complex ideas. I think I've already brought this up, but Locke's epistemological dualism. There are two factors involved in knowledge: the mind, which knows, and its ideas, which are known. Okay, so the mind and its ideas, those are the two factors involved in knowledge. So know something about Locke's epistemological dualism: the two factors, the mind which knows, and the ideas that is known by the mind. But here's a predicament that Locke ran into. He says, if we know only our ideas directly, how can we be certain of their correspondence with things in the external world? You see what he's doing? He says you can only know the ideas. You don't actually know the thing out there. You know the idea of the thing. But the predicament is, if that's true, then how can we be certain of the correspondence of that idea that we have of an external world with the actual thing in the external world? So this is something that could, if you thought about it too much, you could start getting skeptical. It could kind of feed a certain skepticism, because we can't get outside ourselves to verify that the things that are in the world correspond with the idea that we actually know, because we don't know those things directly. We know only the thing that we are thinking, the idea. Doesn't bother me very much, because I think there are ways to confirm, to verify the things that we know in the external world. And then there's radical empiricism. David Hume, he says the source of all knowledge is perceptions, and all ideas are derived from impressions, these vivid or lively sensations that we have. So the immediate data of experience, those are the lively sensations. So first we have sensations, and then the ideas which are based on these sensations. And the ideas are pale copies of the sensations. And our mind works with these ideas. You see? So we have these impressions, these vivid and lively sensations, and then our minds work with the ideas that are based on the sensations. And he was kind of a skeptic, because he said, though we have a natural belief of self, okay, I believe that I am distinct from someone else. I believe in myself. I have an idea of self. And causality, which is the principle that every event must have a cause, right? Every fact or every event must have a cause. Experience gives us no rational knowledge of either of these. Therefore, we must be skeptical of their reality. We don't have experience that gives us rational knowledge of either the self or causality. Therefore, we must be skeptical. And God would be a part of this as well. So let's talk about causality for a minute. He would say all that we perceive is that one thing precedes another. So you think, okay, there's a cause, and then here's the effect. There's A, and then here's B. All we're actually seeing, all that we're perceiving, is that A precedes B. We're not perceiving the necessary connection between A and B. We're just seeing the cause and the effect. He says we can't have any certainty, rational certainty of metaphysical truths beyond matters of fact or relation of ideas, such as 2 + 2 = 4. And we can't even be sure of matters of fact. We can be somewhat sure, but we can't be really sure, because they're derived from specific experiences. Now, we can be sure of matters of logic, things that are true by definition. And like I said, we can know it to a degree, not certainly, but to a degree matters of fact, but we can't know metaphysical realities. And that, of course, would include God. Hume's position is known as phenomenalism. All we can actually know is the phenomena or appearances presented in our perceptions. So according to Hume, we can have no rational certainty of metaphysical truths like causality, the self, God. We can't know those things. Well, let's go to Kant, Immanuel Kant. There's a relationship between Kant and Hume, because Kant claims that it was Hume who awakened him out of his dogmatic slumber. It aroused him. He disagreed with Hume. Hume had concluded that there was no certainty in our knowledge of matters of fact or of existing things. But Kant insists this must be false. Don't we know for certain, reasons Kant, that every effect must have a cause? That there must be a reason for every event? The question is not whether that's the case, but how. And Kant explains to us some important terminology, or makes some distinctions and connections that brings up these terms that I think would be important for you to know. You'll run into these terms. You'll run into terms like a priori and a posteriori. And so these two terms concern the origin of knowledge. So you have a priori knowledge, okay, concerning the origin. It's knowledge which originates independently of sense knowledge, of sense experience. So a priori means it comes prior to sense experience. So 2 + 2 = 4. You don't have to experience that idea that 2 + 2 = 4. And then there's a posteriori knowledge. That is knowledge which originates in sense experience. So a priori, independent of sense experience. A posteriori, it originates in sense experience. So I experience this world and I observe things. I see things, I feel things, and I come to certain information. I acquire certain information. For example, I learned that dogs bark. I have there are lots of dogs in this neighborhood, and I learned through experience that dogs like to bark. And you hope they don't bark too much, right? So there's a priori and a posteriori. And then there's another distinction, and that is concerning the content of knowledge. Now remember, we're talking about epistemology, so we need to talk about the nature of knowledge and the origin of knowledge and the content of knowledge. There is analytic knowledge. That is knowledge that is true by definition, and thus doesn't concern actual experience. In an analytical proposition, the predicate is already contained in the subject. So for example, anything that's a tautology, like barking dogs bark, that doesn't say anything about whether a barking dog exists, whether there are barking dogs. It just is saying, that statement is saying that barking dogs bark. By definition, that's what barking dogs do. They bark, right? Whereas in the case of synthetic knowledge, you're actually saying something about the world. It's knowledge that affirms or denies the existence of something, the actual existence of something. So in a synthetic proposition, the predicate expands or adds to the subject. So in this case, you're saying dogs bark, or people talk, or water is H2O. You're saying something about the real world because you've experienced it, and so you've come to a certain understanding of the reality, and you're making a claim about the real world. So let's put this in a chart. You can actually have analytic a priori knowledge, and that's what all barking dogs bark. Rectangles have 4 sides. All talking women talk. That's analytic a priori knowledge. And then you have synthetic a posteriori knowledge. So this is knowledge about the real world that you gain from your experience. Whereas the a priori analytic knowledge are things that you know apart from experience that are true by definition. You don't need it. It's not claiming anything about the real world. It's just true by definition, and it's not actually saying anything that it exists or not. A posteriori synthetic or synthetic a posteriori knowledge examples are like women talk, dogs bark, water boils at 212 degrees. You see, it's saying something about the real world, and it's information that we know through our experience. Okay, so we've talked about the source of knowledge, and it's saying something about whether it's information about the real world or not. All right? So that's some important terminology. I'd like you to know those things. But here's the question that Immanuel Kant asked. Is there such thing as synthetic a priori knowledge? In other words, are there things that we can know about the world that we know apart from sense experience? Things that maybe we color the world with, or that are necessary, that are universal. These rose-colored glasses that we have on through which we experience the world. So what Kant is doing is explaining how a priori categories of understanding can make experience possible and make knowledge from our experience possible. Every event must have a cause, must be true, because it is part of what is meant by experience. You can't even experience the world apart from these concepts. The concept of causality conditions our experience. The concept of self and causality are not derived from experience. So we don't learn about those things from our experience, but our experience is derived from these a priori concepts that are not just true by definition, they are true, they're saying something, these concepts are saying something about the real world. Okay, so these are synthetic a priori concepts. We have no choice but to experience things, all things, always, in terms of causality. So what he's doing is putting things into another category. So you have those four boxes. He's putting things like the principle of causality in the synthetic a priori box. Okay? So synthetic a priori knowledge, okay, so he's talking about, so there's some limits to this. It's necessarily limited to objects of possible experience, the phenomenal world or the world of appearance. He says this kind of knowledge has nothing to say about the noumenal world or reality as it really is in itself. Now I'm going to want to go back to this and say, you know what? I think that things like the existence of God could be built into our minds, or at least some categories, or at least some capacities already built in there. So it's something that we just kind of assume. We experience the world through a recognition that there must be something greater than the world. Well, it's very similar actually to the principle of causality. So, but what that would do then is open this up to some even metaphysical categories. But he's saying this kind of knowledge, this synthetic a priori knowledge, has nothing to say about the noumenal world or reality as it really is in itself. He said that we can't know by synthetic a priori knowledge anything at all beyond the world of experience. So that is what Kant's saying about this. But he says, however, in addition to the theoretical reason, which operates by means of the concepts of the understanding, we are enabled to penetrate the noumenal world, like what's really out there, what's ultimate reality, like God. We can penetrate the noumenal world by means of the practical reason, which builds on the basis of moral experience. And actually Kant had a moral argument for the existence of God. Actually believed in God. But he also brought in some skepticism and some limitations that were, I think, harmful ultimately to philosophy. I mean, a great philosopher, but kind of led us down a wrong path, which brings this category or this topic up, skepticism. Okay, we talked about Hume, we talked about Kant. They're questioning some things. Now Kant is pushing back on Hume. You know, you don't need to be that radical of an empiricist. You can know some things beyond what you're saying, Hume. But he did still open the door up to some additional skepticism. But let's talk about varieties of skepticism. There is a good kind of skepticism, a common sense skepticism. This is healthy incredulity about unlikely or preposterous claims. For example, what if I were to tell you and make a grand announcement right now, I am God. Let's say I claim to be God, the transcendent God of the universe. Well, that's a preposterous claim. You should be very skeptical of it, just as you should be skeptical of the claim. Well, actually, I just had some Mormons in the classroom to interview with my students this morning, and I asked one of the Mormons, "What is your goal? What do you want to do? What's your ultimate goal? Do you want to become a god and have your own planet, populate your own planet? And he said, yes, I believe that's something that I hope for. That's what I'm working for. Like, man, that is a preposterous proposition. And we ought to be skeptical of that. I mean, I think that's a common sense skepticism, even though you have millions of people following Mormonism. It's crazy. But they're making claims that should be questioned. Common sense skepticism is a corrective to gullibility and superstition and even prejudice. And then there's philosophical skepticism. This is doubt about cherished philosophical beliefs or ideas. So if I doubt or question the principle that every effect must have a cause, or that there's a God, or that there are underlying substances or forms, if I question that the external world is the way that we see it, then I'm a philosophical skeptic, right? I'm a skeptic in a philosophical sense. And then there are the absolute skeptics. Absolute skepticism is the denial of knowledge itself. It's saying we can't know anything. We can't know anything. Which takes us all the way back to Pyrrho, the classic skeptic. He founded the ancient school of skeptics. And he would say things like, a wise man will suspend judgment on all matters. One of his sources is Protagorean relativism. Man is the measure of all things. So we should only say the matter appears to be thus or so. We should suspend judgment on all things, and we make those choices as to what is real or not. But we should suspend judgment. And one argument for this is the relativity of knowledge, because we have different perceptions of the same things, like the taste of an onion. And so since our perceptions are relative, then we really can't know anything. Well, is absolute skepticism a coherent position? What do you think? I think it is not a coherent position. For one thing, it is impractical. No one in their right mind could actually live on such a premise. There's no place for responsible actions. Example, will a skeptic deny the knowledge of a train coming when he's on a train track and he sees a train coming? Is he going to actually say, no, I can't know that, I'm going to suspend judgment? He's not going to suspend judgment. He's going to get off those tracks. Right? It's also impossible. Absolute skepticism is also an impossible proposition. For one thing, it's obvious that some things are certain. And so we've got to, like 2 + 2 = 4. That's obvious, right? But think about what these guys are saying. If someone actually believes in this position of absolute skepticism, which is really very close to an epistemological relativism position, you can't be absolutely sure about anything, and you can be absolutely sure that you can't be absolutely sure about anything, right? You may be absolutely sure of this, that nothing can be known with certainty. Well, that's self-refuting, right? If we do not know anything, well, how do we know that? Well, they might respond, well, I'm not sure of that even. We can't know that we can't know anything. Well then, how can you be sure that you cannot know, that we cannot know anything? You see, it just goes on and on. It's self-refuting. It's a proposition that if true, it's false. Like saying all generalizations are false. Well, that's a generalization, right? Okay, so absolute skepticism is self-refuting. So let me give you a couple more examples. Okay, let's say that sentence 1 says this, sentence 2 is true, but then sentence 2 says sentence 1 is false. So if sentence 2 is true, then that means that wait a minute. It's self-refuting. Look at that closely. If it's false, it's true. If it's true, it's false. Like this. The sentence in this box is false. Do I accept that as true? Well, then it's false. Well, then if it's false, then it's true. If it's true, it's false. So you see it's self-contradictory. And that's what absolute skepticism is. It's self-contradictory. It's self-refuting. All right, one more thing I wanted to mention here is postmodernism. Now this has been around for a while, but it's still something that we have to contend with, because it's really essentially a denial of truth itself. Okay, it's a current form of skepticism, relativism. Let me give you an example of someone who is or was a postmodernist, Richard Rorty. He said that truth is whatever my peers will let me get away with saying. Because you create your own truth. Create your own truth. And this is where I want to come back to a definition of truth. Remember what we said truth is? Truth is correspondence with reality. Okay, it's not something that we create. It's something we discover. Okay? Truth is an idea or statement that corresponds with reality. If it doesn't correspond with reality, if I make a claim that doesn't correspond with reality, then that claim is false. If I make a claim that does correspond with reality, then it's true. Okay? We can't get away from that definition. That's the correspondence theory of truth, which is the real definition. It's a definition that the Bible assumes. And along with that, we have to understand the laws of thought. Let's go back to the laws of thought. Okay? And one of those laws is the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. Truth is not going to violate that principle either. Right? Because if truth is an idea or statement that corresponds with the reality, then it's also going to be consistent. It's going to be coherent. It's not going to contradict itself, because reality doesn't contradict itself. Okay? Something cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. All right, so we've talked about epistemology, the study of the nature of knowledge. And I hope you've learned some things. There are some things that we've talked about that are extremely important for you to carry over into your life, apply them to your life, apply them to your ministry, talk about these things, emphasize these things, be rooted in a basic understanding of truth and the laws of thought. Understand the variety of ways that we do acquire knowledge, because it's not just one source. We do need to verify some things. Some things we are intuitive. We know those. Some things we don't really have to prove. Maybe there are things that shape the way that we understand the world. And there are things that we assume, and we should assume. They're basic truths. They're just basic truths that we should just assume. So, all right, now we're going to move into some metaphysics again by talking about the existence of God and doing some defense of God and defend him against the accusation that evil disproved the existence of God. So we'll talk about some of those things in the concluding part of the course.